Some stories don't get clearer the deeper you go into them. Some stories fracture. The closer you look, the more impossible they become. And Dyatlov is one of those stories. In part 1, we followed 9 experienced hikers into the Ural Mountains, a group who documented everything from inside jokes to trail conditions to their final night together. We traced their route, their decisions, their camp setup, and the moment before everything went sideways. And now we're picking up where that story collapsed. Because the search that followed didn't just reveal bodies, it revealed contradictions, clues that shouldn't exist side by side, evidence that refuses to line up with the official narrative, and injuries that even modern forensic science struggles to explain. Welcome back to an all-new episode of Darkly Speaking. My name is Alex Kern, and before we begin, I wanted to give a quick PSA that I release new episodes every Monday on chilling and unsettling stories from the world of true crime to the eerie realms of the paranormal. I also release video episodes every week on Spotify and YouTube. So I'm calling y'all out today. If you're watching this episode on Spotify, please take a few seconds to rate the show 5 stars. And if you're watching on YouTube, then don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell. As for my audio listeners, don't worry, I didn't forget you. If you're listening from Texas, my home state, please comment wherever you're listening from. Houston, Austin, Dallas, and so on, and please rate wherever you're hearing this episode. Thank you all so much for being here, and I cannot wait to hear from you guys. Now that that's out of the way, tonight, we're stepping into the second half of the mystery. The official investigation, the autopsies, the theories, and the parts of this case that have kept investigators, researchers, and entire generations chasing answers for more than 60 years. So, let's go back to where we left off and begin. For more than 6 decades, from 1959 to 2020, the Dyatlov Pass Tragedy remained officially unexplained. The only official statement ever released claimed the hikers had died due to, quote, an overwhelming force which they were unable to overcome, end quote. No one had ever publicly declared a definitive cause until September of 2018 when the Russian government reopened the case. The stated goal was to reevaluate all known explanations, more than 75 separate theories, and determine which single one could withstand scrutiny. But the scope of the inquiry was limited. The new investigation would only consider natural causes, environmental or weather-related explanations. Any theories involving human foul play, military testing, or paranormal activity, UFOs, cryptids, or anything speculative, were dismissed outright. That meant not only the more outlandish ideas, but even potential human-caused outcomes were excluded, which many found suspicious, including myself. Back in 1959, the original team had briefly considered whether escaped prisoners could have attacked the hikers, a theory which was quickly disproven. Yet in 2018, investigators again ruled out any form of human involvement from the start. Still, they simultaneously pursued questions that directly touched on human actions, like whether any of the bodies had been moved or staged after death. It was an odd contradiction. You see, if human causes were off the table, why investigate signs of human interference at all? The 2018 reinvestigation centered on 3 main questions: whether any post-mortem manipulation of the bodies had occurred, how to explain the severe injuries that could not be attributed to hypothermia, which natural phenomenon, if any, could account for every single death. The official explanation for reopening the Dyatlov file was framed as an act of accountability, because the expedition had been sanctioned by a state institution and approved by government officials. The state claimed a duty to understand how such a tragedy could have happened under its oversight. But I think we can all agree that the timing was pretty peculiar, nearly 59 years after the incident. The case hadn't been revisited in the 1990s when the newly post-Soviet government was emphasizing transparency, but instead, decades later in 2018. Still, the order was signed, the Dyatlov Pass mystery would finally be revisited. Andrei Kryakov, deputy head of the Prosecutor General's Office for the Ural Federal District, led the 2018 investigation. When asked why the case was being reopened after so many years, he replied, quote, "Until we reach a conclusion, such circumstances could be repeated. If we say what happened, it will be possible to correct the rules of behavior on such trips," end quote. Officially, the investigation was presented as a public safety effort, meant to prevent future tragedies in remote environments. But even then, one question quietly persisted. Why wait almost 60 years to ensure that? So, in September of 2018, the mystery of the Dyatlov Pass incident would officially reopen once more. On July 11, 2020, after more than 60 years of speculation, Andrei Kryakov, lead prosecutor of the Dyatlov Pass reinvestigation, stood before cameras and announced that the mystery had finally been solved. According to him, the hikers had died as a result of an avalanche. That was it. After decades of wild theories, missing evidence, and conflicting reports, Russia declared the case closed. You see, in March of 2019, Kryakov led a team of scientists, independent researchers, and investigators on their own expedition into the Ural Mountains, straight to Dyatlov Pass. Their mission was to determine once and for all what had actually happened. By that point, there were already dozens of competing theories: avalanches, UFOs, Yeti encounters, military cover-ups, but the Russian government made it clear that this investigation would focus solely on natural explanations: avalanches, Katabatic winds, and other extreme weather phenomena. By July of 2020, Kryakov explained that his team had carefully reviewed every detail and combed physical evidence with what he called, quote, situational reasoning. In simpler terms, they tried to reconstruct what would have made sense to the hikers in that moment. Their reasoning went a little something like this. If an avalanche struck or was about to, the hikers would have had only seconds to act. Cutting their way out of the tent instead of using the entrance would have been the fastest way to escape. And as for the reason some hikers were fully dressed while others were almost nothing, well, it came down to where they were sleeping and who exactly was awake. Those on watch duty had clothes on, and the others didn't have time to dress before fleeing. In the official version, the rationale was this: Thibault was the one on watch, awake, alert, and partially dressed when the snow shifted. Zolotariov, the oldest and most experienced member of the group, was said to have been fully dressed because he, quote, anticipated danger, end quote. Investigators credited his supposed military training for his quick reaction, claiming he recognized unstable snow conditions before it was just too late. But that claim was shaky. Zolotariov's record showed standard service, not elite military training. His real experience came from his years as a hiking and sports instructor. Someone skilled, yes, but not necessarily a soldier. Still, officials argued he was the one who raised the alarm, helped the group cut through the tent wall and escape. Kryakov even described it as textbook avalanche survival protocol. When your tent entrance is buried, you make a new one. Once outside, the group supposedly made their way about a mile downhill toward the tree line, roughly 1.5 kilometers. Search teams later found footprints showing a calm single-file line. No signs of panic, no running. Just steady movement through the snow. To Kryakov, that meant one thing. They weren't terrified, they were following survival training, likely under Dyatlov or Zolotariov's command. Their path ended near what the reports call the cedar tree. Botanists later confirmed it actually wasn't a cedar tree at all. It was most likely a fir tree, but the name stuck. At the base of the tree, the hikers built a fire that burned for about 90 minutes. The remains, half-charred logs, and scorched branches were still visible when rescuers arrived weeks later. At some point, the fire died out, and with temperatures dropping to nearly negative 30 degrees Celsius, the survivors had to make a choice: stay there and freeze, or move. Kryakov's team concluded that Krivonashenko and Doroshenko, the ones who gathered the wood, were the first to die. The broken branches found 5 meters up the tree were explained as an attempt to climb for better firewood or to spot the tent through the storm. The burns on their hands and legs were said to come from trying to keep the fire alive until the very end. After their deaths, the others took what they could: coats, socks, anything that could help them survive, and divided it among the group. Once they did, they split up. One group decided to head back toward the tent. The other went further down the slope to look for better shelter. Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin were the ones who tried to make it back. They never reached the tent. Their bodies were found spread across the slope, frozen in motion, facing the direction they'd come from. Investigators said that they likely collapsed one by one, overcome by exhaustion and the cold. The final four, Dubinina, Zolotariov, Thibault, and Kolevatov, kept moving downhill, eventually reaching a ravine. There, they built a makeshift snow den, stacking snow walls, lining the floor with cedar branches, and layering clothing for insulation. Now, this was an interesting detail, because it's as if lining the seats and floor of the den with clothing was more important than using that spare clothing for extra layers of warmth. So it suggests that the den group weren't immediately freezing. Otherwise, it stands to reason that they would have used the extra layers for warmth rather than comfort. But according to the official account, that den didn't hold. Experts estimated that part of the den actually collapsed, possibly from melting snow or shifting weight, dropping about 3 meters. The impact, they said, caused the severe injuries found during the autopsies, crushed ribs and skull trauma. Then more snow fell, burying them completely. A year before Kuryakov's public announcement, another government body, the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation, had quietly reviewed the same case files from 1959. So they didn't conduct any new fieldwork or tests. They simply re-examined the evidence and reached the same conclusion. An avalanche caused the group to panic, flee, and eventually succumb to the elements and die of exposure. They argued the hikers' clothing differences came from the chaos of escape, not redistribution from the dead. Their version of the sequence was straightforward. Krivonishenko and Doroshenko died first. Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin froze while trying to return to the tent. The remaining 4 built the den and died when it collapsed. For Russian authorities, that was the end of it. The avalanche theory, combined with exposure and bad luck, neatly explained everything, at least on paper. But to everyone else, researchers, journalists, even scientists within Russia, the story didn't sit right, because the further you looked at the evidence, the less sense it actually made. When the Russian government announced in 2020 that the Dyatlov Pass mystery had finally been solved, the world's response was mixed. Relief for some, disbelief for most. For those who had followed the case for decades, the avalanche explanation felt too convenient. After 6 decades of uncertainty, the official answer arrived neatly wrapped, but didn't quite fit the evidence. And we're about to break it down and essentially argue against why the avalanche theory doesn't make sense. Skeptics immediately pointed out several issues. First, there was absolutely no sign of an avalanche at the site. No displaced snow, no debris field, and no damage consistent with the slide of that scale. The rescue teams then, in 1959, and expeditions nearby at the time, and in the years that followed, also never reported any signs of avalanche behavior. Investigators even camped in the same area during recovery operations and reported no risk of slides. When researchers first found the tent, it was still partially standing, with gear and supplies neatly inside. If a sudden wall of snow had crashed through, it would have buried everything or carried the tent downhill. Instead, it remained intact, cut open from within and surrounded by undisturbed snow. The footprints leading away also told a different story. Calm, single file, measured steps, not the frantic chaos of people fleeing a collapsing slope. For an event supposedly powerful enough to crush ribs and skulls, it left remarkably little trace. Also, remember in part 1 when I mentioned the disagreement between where exactly the tent was found? Yeah, well, that would also pose to be a point of contention. The disagreement over the tent's exact location becomes a real problem once the avalanche theory enters the picture. Yes, we have photographs of the scene, but we don't actually know the precise spot where the tent was pitched. More than 6 decades of snowfall, erosion, and shifting tree lines mean the original landscape can't be reconstructed with certainty. Researchers who studied the mountain's topography estimate the slope where the tent stood was between 15 and 20 degrees. That's important because avalanche specialists consistently note that this gradient is too shallow to generate a slab large enough or forceful enough to cause fatal crushing injuries. At most, it could produce small surface slides, but not the kind of event required to explain the trauma found on several of the hikers. And then there's the simulation, the snow physics model Kuryakov's team used, famously built from the same technology behind Disney's Frozen. But here's the issue. Simulations are only as accurate as the data you feed them. If the exact tent's location is unknown, you can't reliably model snow load, wind direction, or slab formation. That uncertainty alone means the simulator can't definitively prove or disprove the avalanche theory. Another key issue is what the group left inside the tent before they fled. The inventory recovered included a large amount of essential winter gear: parkas, jackets, boots, gloves, hats, tools, and navigation equipment. Most of it still neatly arranged inside the tent. Even their knives remained stored away, with 2 tucked into parkas and Kolevatovs still sheathed, suggesting they hadn't been used at all. Aside from Thibault, who was likely on night watch, and Zolotariov, who was inexplicably fully dressed, the rest of the group left the tent without proper footwear. Dyatlov, Krivanashenko, Doroshenko, Dubinina, Kolevatov, and Kolmogorova were barefoot. Zolotariov wore handmade leather Birka shoes. Slobodin had just 1 felt boot. Thibault had 2. These thick felt boots are designed for dry snow and short-distance movement in freezing conditions. Every member wore at least a base layer: underwear, undershirt, socks, long underwear or sweatpants, an overshirt, and a sweater or light jacket. This matters because it suggests they had seconds, maybe a minute, to react. Enough time to grab 1 extra layer, but not enough time to dress for a full evacuation. Light clothing obviously goes on first. You can't pull a parka over missing layers or put socks on once your boots are already on. Whatever forced them out gave them only moments. Now, one of the most debated pieces to this story is why the group left the tent in the first place. According to Kuryakov's version, he says the group left the tent and walked roughly 1.5 kilometers downhill toward the tree line to escape the wind. But even that raises questions. If shelter was the priority, they could have stepped just 10 to 20 meters deeper into the forest for far better protection and access to firewood. Instead, they stopped at the forest's edge, built a fire, and stayed exposed. Kuryakov attributed it to exhaustion, which makes 0 sense, by the way. The group wouldn't make their way 1.5 kilometers down the slope just to stop 10 meters short at the tree line if their primary goal was shelter and warmth, simply because they got tired. That explanation especially doesn't hold up when you consider what happened next. Someone climbed the tree for branches. Scaling a tree 5 meters high requires far more energy than walking an additional 30 feet into the woods. Kuryakov claimed Krivanashenko and Doroshenko were solely responsible for gathering wood and died from exhaustion while doing so. But why would only 2 people be tasked with collecting firewood when the others were still fully mobile and uninjured? It's far more plausible that everyone searched for wood at some point. Krivanashenko and Doroshenko likely climbed the tree to reach higher branches, which fits the bruises and abrasions found on both men, injuries consistent with falling. And even then, climbing for firewood doesn't fully make sense. Fresh branches from a living tree are wet and burn poorly. Dead wood on the ground, though covered in snow, would have been drier and better for kindling. So if climbing wasn't just about firewood, what were they trying to do? The fact that they climbed the tree at all adds another inconsistency to the avalanche explanation, thus raising even more questions about what the group believed they were facing, including the exact conditions their bodies were found in based on their autopsy reports. Now, stick with me here because we're not cutting any corners. When investigators examined Yuri Doroshenko's body, the first thing they noted was the condition of his skin. It had shifted into a brown-purple tone, a discoloration that commonly appears in extreme cold, but the livor mortis told a different story. the pooling of blood had settled along the back of his neck, torso, and limbs. The problem? That wasn't the position in which his body had been found, which means at some point after his death, he had been moved. His head and upper body showed a series of injuries that raised even more red flags. His hair was filled with moss and pine needles, and the right side of it had singed, burned by something. Blood covered his ears, nose, and lips. His upper lip was swollen and dark red from internal hemorrhaging. On his right cheek, a streak of grayish foam and fluid had pooled and begun to drain from his mouth, something frequently associated with pulmonary edema. Both ears were flushed a bluish-red color, and on the right ear, the lobe, and the tragus, investigators found dense brown-red patches. Moving downward, the right inner shoulder carried 2 abrasions, each 2 by 1.5 centimeters, along with no bleeding in the tissues and 2 small cuts in the skin. In his right armpit was a bruise, 2 by 1.5 centimeters, and along the upper third of his right forearm were several brown-red bruises ranging in size, 4 by 1 centimeters, 2.5 by 1.5 centimeters, and one as large as 5 by 5 centimeters. His right hand was swollen with small abrasions across the back of it, and beneath the skin over his second metacarpal bone there was bleeding, evidence of impact. Both hands and fingertips had turned dark purple. Frostbite had already destroyed much of the soft tissue. The same was true for his toes. According to the examiner, had Doroshenko survived, every finger and toe would have required amputation. Across his left arm and shoulder, there were similar abrasions, a brown dark red mark on the lower third of the shoulder, small reddish abrasions on the left elbow, and a superficial wound on his forearm that had begun to crust over with dried blood. Both of his shins showed pale red bruising. Inside his body, there was another telling detail. His bladder held only 150 cubic centimeters of urine, far lower than what is typically seen in hypothermia deaths. According to the National Library of Medicine, in most hypothermia cases, the bladder is full. Doroshenko's wasn't, which suggests that at the time of his death, his body was still actively fighting the cold. And then there's the foam. The grayish fluid found on his cheek led some to argue that pressure had been applied to his chest shortly before he died. The pattern resembled in what's seen in compression-related pulmonary edema, which is a condition where fluid accumulates in the lungs, making it difficult to breathe. Now, this is also something that has been compared to interrogation techniques used by the NKVD, the Soviet Special Forces, where pressure on the chest restricts breathing until fluid backs up into the lungs. Another explanation is far less conspiratorial. He may have taken a significant fall from the cedar tree. But in the final Soviet paperwork, none of this speculation made it into the official record. His death was simply listed as hypothermia. All abrasions and bruises, according to the official experts, were classified as non-fatal injuries they believed came from rocks, ice, or nearby objects while he was in the final stages of terminal freezing. Based on stomach contents, they estimated he died 6 to 8 hours after his last meal. Even so, the combination of burns, bruising, movement after death, pulmonary foam, and the condition of his hands paints a far more complicated picture than the tidy conclusion suggests. Now, let's move into the autopsy findings for Yuri Krivonischenko, who was found alongside Doroshenko at the cedar tree. His injuries, while not fatal on their own, paint a vivid picture of what he endured in his final hours. First, the head and facial injuries. Krivonischenko had a small bruise on his forehead, measuring 0.3 by 1.8 centimeters. Examiners noted diffuse bleeding along the right temporal and occipital regions, bleeding caused by damage to the temporalis muscle on the side of his head. He also had bruising around the left temporal bone. The tip of his nose was missing, but with no bleeding. That tells us it happened after death, almost certainly from animal activity. His body had been found face up, which fits that interpretation. Both ears showed clear frostbite. Then we look at what was found inside of his mouth. An unsettling detail. A piece of skin from his own right hand was discovered between his teeth. There are 2 possible interpretations here. He may have been biting down on his hand in an attempt to wake up numb fingers while climbing the tree, or he may have been trying to muffle a cry during severe pain or distress. Both interpretations match the state of his injuries. Now, moving to the hands, fingers, and arms, the back of his right hand was swollen and the fingers were a brown-purple color, which means early frostbite that progressed pretty quickly. His fingertips were dark brown with small abrasions along the soft tissue. On the palm of his right hand, he had a bluish-red discoloration and a dark brown wound with jagged edges at the base of his thumb. 2 of his fingers, the middle phalanges of the 4th and 5th digits, had skin wounds with hardened edges and charred surfaces. On the back of his left hand, there was a 2-centimeter patch where the epidermis had completely detached. His chest and torso showed additional signs of struggle. There were pale red abrasions on the right side of his chest, one measuring 7 by 2 centimeters and another 2 by 1.2 centimeters. Along the right hypochondrium, near the lower edge of the ribs, there were more pale red abrasions. His left wrist also had a dark red abrasion, and the back of his left hand was swollen. The injuries continued down the body. A large bruise, 10 by 3 centimeters, covered part of the left buttocks. On the upper inner portion of his left thigh, he had 3 linear skin lesions with clean, sharp edges and sharp corners, each up to 0.3 centimeters deep. There were also 3 additional skin wounds with similarly sharp corners on the upper third of the left hip. On his right thigh and shin, dark brown abrasions covered the front surfaces. The left thigh had dark brown-red abrasions as well. His left leg and foot showed signs of edema, along with a massive burn covering the entire outer surface of the leg, 31 by 10 centimeters. His right shin had dark brown abrasions, and the back of his left foot had a 10 by 4 centimeter patch of peeling epidermis. The second toe on that same foot was charred, dark brown, and hardened, another sign of direct contact with fire. Internally, the autopsy recorded 500 cubic centimeters of urine in the bladder, a detail consistent with hypothermia. As referenced before, in freezing conditions, the body produces unusually large amounts of urine, which supports the conclusion that he died from the cold. The official cause of death was listed as hypothermia. But the presence of skin from his own hand inside his mouth paints a more visceral picture of his final moments. A young man clinging to the freezing tree, trying desperately to wake the hands he needed to survive, or trying to stifle a scream. And here's the context that matters most. Krivonashenko and Doroshenko were the first 2 hikers found at the Cedar. Their injuries, exposed skin and early-stage frostbite, tell us that they likely died before the others, long before anyone realized how dire the situation had become. After their deaths, the remaining hikers removed their clothing, cutting or stripping layers with care and dividing them among the group. They didn't do this out of confusion or panic, but because it was the only rational way to survive temperatures that would kill them within minutes. But here's where the trail goes cold, literally and figuratively. We know that the group used Doroshenko and Krivonashenko's clothing. We know they built a fire. We know they were still thinking clearly enough to ration warmth and plan their next moves. What we don't know is the moment everything shifted, when the group split, why they separated, and what exactly they were facing in those final hours. This is where things start to fracture. The footprints diverge, the decisions get harder to explain, and the mystery deepens instead of clarifying. We know the split happened after the deaths of Doroshenko and Krivonashenko for a few very clear reasons. The group had extra layers taken from the men at the cedar tree. If everyone had been trying to head back toward the tent together, then as Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin fell one by one, the surviving hikers would have taken their clothing too, just as they did with the first 2. But none of that clothing on Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, or Slobodin had been removed. They were found in exactly what they left the tent wearing. That alone tells us those 3 died apart from the others and before anyone could regroup. So the real question becomes, why did they split and what forced them out of the tent so suddenly? The state of the tent and what was left behind makes it obvious that they fled in a hurry. Heavy layers, parkas, most of their boots are all still inside. Their state of dress makes it clear that they had mere moments, not minutes, to react. We also have to consider direction. Some of the group clearly tried to head upslope toward the tent, while the others may have intended to aim for the storage cache. Both routes from the tent were downslope, but in darkness or a blizzard, it would have been easy to become disoriented and head north instead of south, completely missing the cache. And that also leaves room for the idea that Krivonischenko and Doroshenko climbed the cedar tree to get visibility, trying to spot the cache or the tent through low light and blowing snow. So the split might have been a disagreement, or a deliberate division of labor. One group trying to reach the tent to grab clothing or tools, and the other starting a fire and building a shelter. But to really understand what happened in that moment and why their paths diverged, we need to look at the injuries to Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin next. Igor Dyatlov was found about 300 meters from the cedar tree, lying on his back in the snow with his head pointed toward the tent, as if he'd been trying to make his way back. Only his hands were visible above the snow. Both were clenched tight against his chest, frozen in that position. One strange detail was that his jacket was unbuttoned, and in hypothermia cases, people instinctively close their clothing, not open it. On the surface, his injuries looked minor. He had abrasions on his forehead, on the upper eyelids, and brown-red abrasions above the left eyebrow. His cheeks, both of them, showed the same brown-red abrasions, and there was also dried blood around his lips. As for the rest of his body, both knees were bruised, but without bleeding into the tissues underneath, meaning the trauma happened either right before death or shortly after. His ankles had brown-red abrasions measuring 1 by 0.5 centimeters and 3 by 2.5 centimeters, and both showed internal hemorrhaging. On his right leg, there was a clean incision on the lower third of the tibia, about 4 by 2 centimeters. Now, his hands told their own story. On the right hand and forearm, there were multiple small dark red scratches and purple-gray discoloration on the back of the hand. Across the knuckles, he had brown-red bruises, the exact pattern you would see for someone who had been striking something or someone with a closed fist. The left hand was completely brown-purple, with more brown-red bruises and superficial wounds on the second and fifth fingers, plus additional cuts on the palm side of both of those fingers. Inside, there were no internal injuries noted. His bladder contained about 1,000 cubic centimeters of urine, a very large amount and fully consistent with death by hypothermia. And one last detail adds to the timeline. Dyatlov was wearing a long-sleeved shirt that Yuri Yudin later identified as his own, the same shirt he'd given to Doroshenko before turning back. That means Dyatlov took it from Doroshenko's body after he died, likely to stay warm. The official cause of death for Igor Dyatlov was hypothermia. Zina Kolmogorova was found 630 meters from the cedar tree, lying face down in the snow with her head oriented toward the tent. The skin on her face and hands had turned a deep purple red, the kind of discoloration seen in severe cold exposure and early postmortem changes. Her visible injuries were concentrated across her face, hands, and lower back. On her forehead, she had a dark red abrasion along with a pale gray patch around 3 by 2 centimeters above the right eyebrow. Both upper eyelids were marked with dark red abrasions. A brown-red graze crossed the bridge and tip of her nose, and her left cheekbone showed multiple abrasions. The right side of her face was bruised, consistent with either a fall or forceful contact with ice or terrain. Her hands showed brown-red abrasions across the backs of both, clustered over the knuckles and joints. On the back of her right hand, near the base of the third finger, she had a wound with jagged edges and missing skin. One of her most notable injuries was on her torso, a long, bright red bruise measuring 29 by 6 centimeters across the right side of her lower back. The width and shape were striking, to say the least, the kind of mark often associated with a baton or similar blunt object. Internally, her bladder contained approximately 300 cubic centimeters of urine. The official cause of death was listed as hypothermia due to a violent accident. Rustem Slobodin was discovered on March 5th, the day after the first 4 autopsies were completed. His body was found 480 meters from the cedar tree, lying face down in the snow with his head pointed toward the tent. He had one arm flung out to the side and the other a bit in front of him, almost as if he'd been running mid-stride when he froze. He'd been buried under roughly 50 centimeters of snow. Compared to the first few victims, Rustem was more appropriately dressed, though still nowhere near equipped for the brutal cold that he faced. Rustem's external injuries told a complicated story. His head and face showed clear signs of trauma, hemorrhaging in both temples, minor abrasions across his forehead, 2 parallel scratches about 1.5 centimeters long and 0.3 centimeters apart, and a distinct brownish-red bruise on the upper right eyelid with hemorrhaging beneath the tissue. Blood had dried beneath his nose, and both sides of his face were swollen and marked with small abrasions. His hands and arms revealed more clues. Both knuckles were severely bruised, the kind of injury pattern usually seen when someone is striking something or someone with closed fists, similar to Dyatlov's hand injuries. There were brown cherry-colored bruises on his inner left arm and palm, and the epidermis of his right forearm had been torn away. His lips were swollen as well. Lower on the body, Rustem had bruising along the left tibia measuring 2.5 by 1.5 centimeters, as well as additional abrasions and markings noted by the forensic team. One of the most important findings was a skull fracture, a long, thin break measuring 6 by 0.1 centimeters located about 1.5 centimeters from the sagittal suture. This fracture appeared on a separate trauma diagram and stood out as more than just a minor injury. Forensic expert Boris Vazrazdanye, who as a reminder conducted Slobodin's autopsy alone without a team present, suggested the fracture was caused by a blunt object. He also noted that the blow likely impaired Rustem's coordination immediately afterward, something that would have dramatically accelerated the onset of hypothermia. But despite these observations, the official cause of death remained hypothermia. The injury patterns themselves were, however, red flags to say the least. Autopsy notes described many of his scratches and bruises as the result of, quote, terminal agony, end quote. But several details didn't match what's typically seen in freezing deaths. The injuries were focused on the face and sides of the skull, but not the back of the head. The bruises on his hands and legs were also inconsistent with someone simply collapsing in the snow. It appeared he may have fallen multiple times, pitching forward and striking the sides of his head as he descended, an unusual pattern for someone as strong and athletic as Rustem. Environmental evidence adds another layer here. Rustem was found on what investigators described as an icy bed, meaning the snow beneath him had melted and then refrozen. That only happens when a warm body remains in place long enough to transfer heat into the snow, though it's unclear whether similar observations were documented for the other victims. Then there's the livor mortis. For Doroshenko, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin, lividity appeared at the top surfaces of their bodies, suggesting they were turned over after death. Whether that happened naturally or intentionally remains one of the most debated anomalies in Dyatlov research. Across the group, certain patterns begin to emerge, especially when you look at the injuries side by side. Several of the hikers had bruised knuckles, the kind of injuries you'd normally expect to see when someone has been striking something or someone with force. Those hikers were Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, Slobodin, Krivonashenko, and even Doroshenko, though his were a little bit milder. What stands out is that none of the 4 hikers found inside the den had bruised knuckles at all. That detail alone suggests that whatever physical struggle may have occurred affected the tent to Cedar group, but not the den group. When you break down the injuries individually, that pattern becomes even more clear. Igor Dyatlov had bruised knuckles, abrasions on his forehead, eyelid, eyebrows, and both cheeks, and linear wounds on 2 fingers. Injuries that could resemble defensive cuts, the kind you might get trying to block a knife or even a sharp branch. Zina Kolmogorova had bruised knuckles as well, along with abrasions across her face, a striking 29-centimeter bruise across her back and side, shaped like it was made by a baton-like object, and a jagged wound on the back of her right hand. Rustem Slobodin had bruised knuckles too, extensive abrasions on his head and face, swollen lips, a bloody nose, and of course, the skull fracture that couldn't be explained by falling on soft snow. Krivonashenko's bruised knuckles may have come from falling out of the cedar tree, so his injuries are harder to interpret. But the bruises were there. Doroshenko had only 1 bruised knuckle, so whether his was related to a struggle or a fall is unclear. Then there's the issue of the knives. At both the Cedar and the den, the group would have needed knives for breaking branches, cutting clothing, and constructing the snow shelter. But Almost every knife was found inside the tent. 3 sheathed knives inside parkas and a pocket knife in Dyatlov's parka. None were found on any of the other bodies. That either means no one else carried a knife on them, or the knives never left the tent at all, which raises the question of how the Cedar fire and the den were even built. Other injuries complicate things further. Rustam's skull fracture was officially attributed to a fall, but he fell onto deep snow, not a rock or ice. The fracture was too severe to be caused by a fist or a knee, and there were no large rocks or tree limbs nearby that could explain it. That leaves 2 possibilities. He started back toward the tent already injured, or the injury occurred shortly before he collapsed, but not from a simple fall. Zena's long bruise is also difficult to explain. It doesn't match the shape or logic of a fall in snow. It looks far more like a baton-type impact, something straight, long, and applied with force. Slobodin had 2 patches of missing skin on his right forearm, but the clothing over that area wasn't torn, which means the injury happened before he got dressed. That rules out scavenging animals entirely. Then there's the question of body movement after death. Both Kolmogorova and Slobodin showed signs that their bodies had been repositioned after death, while Dyatlov did not. That poses problems for timeline reconstruction. Dyatlov died first, yet he's the only one with no signs of being moved. Slobodin and Kolmogorova died later, but no one stripped them of clothing, and no one would have had a reason to reposition them. Livor mortis adds to even more confusion. In several victims, blood pooling appeared on body surfaces inconsistent with the way their bodies were found. For example, if Slobodin was found face down, lividity should appear on the front, but it was documented on his back. That indicates post-mortem movement, though the degree and interpretation of that finding is still debated. All of this brings us to one of the biggest junction points in the case. Why would anyone attempt to climb back to the tent at all? One explanation is that they believed the avalanche threat, if there even was one, had passed. The tent meant shelter, warmth, food, and tools, but even that theory has its own contradictions. If an avalanche had truly struck, they would have expected the tent to be buried. Another possibility is that something other than an avalanche forced them out. A fire, a threat, an attacker. There was no sign of fire in the tent, but they may have believed returning was still safer than staying exposed. There's also the possibility that some kind of confrontation took place near the Cedar. The bruised knuckles, facial injuries, the baton-like bruise on Zena, these could point to a struggle that split the group between those heading back toward the tent and those building the den. Meanwhile, the den group, who were better dressed and more insulated, walked 50 meters south of the Cedar, built a snow shelter lined with cedar branches, and stayed there. They didn't attempt the climb back toward the tent. If the tent had been buried, supplies would have been unreachable. And for those who were better dressed, the risk just didn't make sense. Even if food is still inside the tent, attempting that climb in the dark could have been fatal. So what we're left with is a fractured scene. Injuries suggesting possible conflict among the tent to Cedar group, a den group acting with calm and logic, and no single explanation that ties every single detail together. This is where the case begins to branch into multiple competing theories, and none of them, not a single one, fully fit the evidence. The group that made it to the den didn't simply stumble into the ravine and collapse. Their actions tell us they were still thinking clearly, still working together, and still trying to survive. They must have returned to the Cedar multiple times to gather branches for their shelter that they were building. That alone tells us something important. Whatever happened at the Cedar, it wasn't an active threat. If they'd been attacked there, or if something dangerous had been waiting for them, they would have never risked going back. We also know that they removed clothing from Doroshenko and Krivonashenko after their deaths. Dubinina was found wearing Krivonashenko's sweater. That one detail confirms the group was redistributing layers strategically, pulling warmth from their fallen and making sure the living had every possible advantage against the cold. This wasn't chaotic or irrational behavior. This was intentional, organized survival. And the den itself reflects that mindset. They weren't wandering aimlessly. They built a structured snow shelter, lined the floor with cedar branches to insulate themselves from the frozen ground, and used spare clothing as makeshift padding. Every choice they made showed rationed energy, teamwork, and clear thinking right up until the end. But here's where the real mystery begins. 3 out of the 4 members of the Den group did not die from hypothermia. Instead, they suffered severe, catastrophic trauma. Massive rib fractures, crushed chests, skull damage, and internal bleeding. Doctors compared the extent of the damage to being hit by a car. These are not injuries explained by cold exposure. They mark a sudden escalation, a turning point in the story, and they raise questions no official theory has ever fully answered. Strangely, the group was also found several feet from the actual shelter of the den, in the deepest part of the ravine. To understand what happened next, how a group working together, thinking logically, suddenly ended up with injuries more like the result of a car crash than a winter storm, we have to turn to the autopsy findings once more. So, let's start with Dubinina. Ludmila Dubinina's body was found in one of the most unsettling positions of the entire recovery. She was discovered kneeling, her face and chest pressed directly against a rock surface. The spot where she was found formed a natural ledge, and water had been flowing over her body for weeks. This is an important detail when it comes to understanding some of the soft tissue loss noted later in her autopsy. What made her discovery even more disturbing was the condition of her face. Soft tissue was missing around the eyes, eyebrows, the bridge of the nose, and part of the left cheekbone. A 4-centimeter square of tissue was gone from the area around her left temporal bone. Both eye sockets were empty. Her eyes were completely gone. The cartilage of her nose was broken and flattened. Tissue from her upper lip was also missing, leaving her teeth and upper jaw fully exposed. Her tongue was also missing, and while the autopsy states this plainly, it gives no explanation for why or how. It also notes that the hypoglossal muscle and several floor of mouth muscles were absent, but doesn't clarify the cause. Internally, Ludmila suffered extensive trauma. She had multiple rib fractures. On the right side, ribs 2 through 5, each with 2 fracture lines. On the left, ribs 2 through 7, also each fractured in 2 places. There was massive hemorrhaging into the right atrium of her heart, indicating a violent compressive force. A 10 by 5 centimeter bruise was also found on the middle of her left thigh. So, because she was found lying on a ledge with flowing water running over her body, some of the soft tissue loss, especially to the face, can be attributed to natural decomposition and moving water. Her mouth was open when she was found, and despite widespread claims that her tongue was ripped out or eaten, the autopsy does not say this. It simply says the tongue and eyes are missing. Her stomach contained about 100 grams of dark brown mucosal material, which is often misinterpreted as coagulated blood, but the report does not confirm this. Her official cause of death was listed as massive internal bleeding to the right atrium, multiple rib fractures, and extensive internal hemorrhaging. Semyon Zolotariov's body was also discovered at the den site, and unlike the others, he was clearly not succumbing to the cold at the time of his death. He was one of the best-dressed hikers and also carried several personal items, coins, a compass, a newspaper, and a few other belongings. But what stood out most was the camera hanging around his neck. Yuri Yudin, the group's sole survivor, believed the group only brought 4 cameras, all recovered inside the tent, so this 5th camera appearing only on Zolotariov's body raised questions from the start. The film inside was ruined by meltwater, leaving whatever he photographed a complete mystery. Adding to that mystery, Zolotariov was found holding a pen in one hand and a small notepad in the other. Vladimir Ashkenazy, one of the rescuers from the May search, later claimed that Colonel Ortyukov, the head of the military department of the Ural Polytech Institute, grabbed the notebook, flipped through it, and said it contained nothing before it disappeared. The notebook was never entered into evidence and has never been seen again. That story, however, comes solely from Ashkenazy, told nearly 6 decades after the fact, making its reliability uncertain. Zolotariov's external injuries were severe. His eyeballs were missing, and soft tissue around his left eyebrow, a 7 by 6 centimeter section, was completely gone, leaving bone exposed. On the right side of his skull, a 8 by 6 centimeter wound revealed exposed bone as well. The autopsy noted a flailed chest with rib fractures on the right side, ribs 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, each showing 2 distinct fracture lines. Internally, the trauma was catastrophic. Every rib injury involved enormous force with hemorrhaging into the cardiac muscle and pleural cavity, meaning he was alive when the injuries occurred. The pattern of damage was strikingly similar to the trauma documented in Dubinina, despite the significant differences in their body types. Vazrazdanye stated that the injuries were caused by an extremely powerful force. The lack of external chest trauma combined with the internal destruction resembled injuries produced by a sort of shockwave, something similar to an explosion. Medical estimates suggest that Dubinina lived around 10 to 20 minutes after her injuries and may have even remained conscious. Zolotariov, however, likely lived even longer. Their physical fitness and training could have given them enough resilience to survive briefly despite the catastrophic trauma. And finally, the questions that still hang over this case: why did Zolotariov leave the tent with 2 cameras? Why was the camera apparently hidden until the moment of his death? Why did he attempt to record on that film, and where exactly was the missing notebook, and why was it never recovered or entered into evidence? Alexander Kolevatov's body was found clutching Zolotariov's and showed extensive soft tissue loss around the eyes, with the eyebrows completely gone and the skull bone exposed in those areas. His skin had taken on a gray-green purplish tint, the kind of discoloration that happens when a body has been in a cold, wet environment for an extended period of time. The skin on his fingers and feet appeared softened and whitened, a maceration pattern consistent with prolonged exposure to moisture and snowmelt. The bridge of his nose remained straight, but the cartilage beneath was strangely mobile when examined. Soft, flexible, and flattened at the base, his nostrils were compressed. None of this automatically proves a broken nose, but it was undoubtedly abnormal. Behind his ear was an open wound measuring 3 by 1.5 centimeters. His neck was also clearly deformed, though the autopsy provided no explanation for how or when that deformation occurred. There was also diffuse bleeding in the tissues of his left knee, an injury that had to have happened while he was still alive. Oddly, this trauma was noted in the written report, but not shown on the accompanying diagrams. Now, this is where Kolevatov's autopsy becomes especially frustrating. The documentation is unusually vague. There is no attempt to determine whether the nose cartilage mobility, the wound behind the ear, or the neck deformation came from a fall, an assault, mishandling, or simply decomposition after months in the elements. The report avoids any speculation entirely. Some researchers point out that certain injuries, like a snapped neck or a precise blow behind the ear, resemble trauma patterns associated with specialized killing techniques used by trained personnel, special forces. But it's important to be extremely clear here. The autopsy does not confirm this. There is no explicit evidence indicating whether these wounds were inflicted before or after death. And 3 months of exposure to freezing temperatures, meltwater, and wildlife could easily distort soft tissue and alter the position or appearance of the neck. Because of the limited detail, the true origin of Kolevatov's injuries remains uncertain. And finally, Nikolai Thibault was one of the best-dressed hikers of the group when he was found. He wore multiple layers and had proper footwear, unlike most of the hikers. This detail has led to the long-held theory that he and Semyon Zolotariov may have been outside the tent when the unidentified threat forced the group to flee. Their preparedness may reflect that they were already awake, dressed, or on duty. Cadaveric spots were noted on the back of his upper body, his neck, and his upper extremities. The most significant findings involved severe trauma to his skull. He suffered multiple fractures to the temporal bone, with cracks extending into the frontal bone and sphenoid bone. Case file images show the complexity and brutality of these fractures. He also had a bruise on the upper left side of his lip and a large hemorrhage on his lower forearm, measuring 10 by 12 centimeters. Forensic examiner Vazrazdanye stated that these injuries were far too severe and too unusual to have been caused by a simple fall on rocks. He explicitly ruled out an accidental fall from standing height. According to his official interrogation transcript, the fractures were extensive, depressed, and multi-splintered, including damage to the fornix and base of the skull. This level of trauma was not consistent with someone tripping and simply hitting their head. The report outlined possible mechanisms: the body being thrown or forcefully dropped, the body being jettisoned by strong external force, or a powerful gust of wind, sending him airborne into rocks or ice. These comparisons are not metaphors. The examiner specified that the pattern resembled trauma observed in high-speed automobile impacts. A car wreck or car crash. A blow from a handheld rock was dismissed as well. Such an impact would have caused major soft tissue damage, which was not present. Vazrazdanye concluded that after sustaining this head injury, Thibault would have entered an unconscious state almost immediately. He would not have been able to walk or move on his own. Even with help, he could not have traveled any distance. He would have needed to be carried or dragged. He may have shown minimal signs of life for 2 or 3 hours, but would not have been capable of any purposeful movement. Something to note is that several items of clothing recovered from the den group showed mild radioactive contamination. Kolevatov's sweater and pants, Krivonashenko's sweater, and Dubinina's sweater, which originally belonged to Krivonashenko. Both Kolevatov and Krivonashenko worked with radioactive materials in their day-to-day jobs, but radiologists noted that the levels found were higher than expected from normal occupational exposure. Their conclusion was that the contamination was most likely from airborne radioactive dust. The clothing sat in running water for months, continuously washing particles away. Importantly, there's no evidence that the radiation had anything to do with how anyone died. All 4 members of the den group had significant soft tissue loss. Dubinina was missing her eyes, tongue, and facial tissue. Zolotariov had missing eyes and soft tissue around the brow. Kolevatov had missing tissue around the brow and eye, and finally, Thibault had also showed some facial tissue loss. None of the earlier bodies found higher on the slope had these changes. The den group was discovered in running water, not frozen snow, and water exposure combined with decomposition and scavenging animals explains the missing tissue far more reliably than anything else. While skin peeling can occur in radiation poisoning, the group was not exposed to anywhere near the levels required for those symptoms. The tissue loss aligns with water exposure, not radiation. After separating from Dyatlov's group, the den group left the tree line, built a snow shelter further downhill, and returned repeatedly to the cedar tree to gather branches. Their choice to build the den away from the cedar suggests they believed digging a shelter was easier and more effective. A major problem remains, though. No tools were found at either location, yet the den's construction required cutting branches. Every finished knife belonging to Kolevatov, Thibault, and Krivonashenko was found inside the tent. Dyatlov's pocket knife was also found in the tent. This leaves no confirmed explanation for how the branches were cut. The den group suffered the most severe and least explainable injuries. Dubinina's crushed chest, missing eyes, missing tongue, Thibault's massive skull fracture, and Zolotariov's shattered ribs and missing eyes. Dr. Vazrazdanye described Thibault's injuries consistent with being thrown, falling several meters, or being projected forcefully onto rock or ice, comparable to high-speed automobile trauma. Then there's Dubinina and Zolotariov's chest injuries, showing multiple rib fractures and internal bleeding caused by tremendous force, similar to a blast-type pressure wave. A critical issue still remains, though, because the medical examiner was never asked to reevaluate Kolevatov's injuries. This is especially problematic because prosecutor Kuryakov later claimed all 4 den group members died at the same time from the same cause, contradicting the forensic record. Based on what we know about everyone's injuries at the den, this is virtually impossible. This is where we also have to take a look at the approximate dimensions and the details of the den itself. The den itself sat about 2.5 meters beneath the snow surface when it was uncovered. It was positioned roughly 50 meters from the cedar tree and only about 6 meters from the edge of the ravine. Inside, the den showed signs of deliberate construction. 14 fir branches had been arranged to create a floor area of about 3 square meters. Clothing was placed on top of those branches, forming a makeshift seat and insulation so that the group can stay elevated and limit direct contact with the snow. A smart strategy, honestly, for conserving heat. However, the size of the den suggests something important. It was too small to comfortably hold 7 people. That means the den group either wasn't expecting Dyatlov's team to return, or they simply didn't have enough materials and planned to squeeze together tightly for warmth. Okay, so this is where things get a little bit crazy, because according to prosecutor Kuryakov, the 4 hikers at the den supposedly fell at least 2 meters into the ravine beside it. He claimed the den collapsed and the group slid both downward and sideways at the same time, a diagonal fall into the ravine. But the physical measurements don't support this. Rescuers recorded the den's depth at about 2.5 to 3 meters below the snow surface, and the bodies were found at a depth of 2 to 2.5 meters. That's a maximum difference of just 0.5 meter to a meter, roughly a 1 to 3 foot drop. Even onto rocks, that kind of short fall cannot explain the catastrophic injuries found on the den group. Zolotariov's shattered ribcage, Dubinina's bilateral rib fractures, or Thibault's massive skull trauma. And it certainly doesn't explain why Kolevatov was unable to get up at all. So the official claim requires us to believe the following. A snow den collapsed downward, the hikers simultaneously fell sideways into a ravine, and a fall of less than a meter caused extensive internal trauma. Once all of the details are laid out, the ravine fall explanation becomes physically impossible, forcing us to confront the reality that something else happened at that site. The official Russian narrative begins with a simple claim. Someone in the group allegedly spotted an avalanche coming toward the tent, triggering an immediate evacuation. According to this version, the hikers left with such urgency that no one put on boots, and instead of using the entrance, they sliced open the side of the tent to escape. Yet, despite this supposed panic, they somehow managed to walk away in a perfectly organized, single-file line, calm, coherent, and controlled. From there, the contradictions only grow, by the way. The group walked 1.5 kilometers downhill in the wrong direction. These were 9 experienced hikers fully capable of navigating harsh terrain, yet the state's version asks us to believe they were clear-headed enough to descend in a straight line, but too disoriented to realize they were moving further away from shelter. Then, when they reached the tree line, the official timeline claims that they built a fire, but only 2 members climbed the cedar tree and gathered branches, and those 2 conveniently died first from exhaustion and exposure. After their deaths, the remaining 7 supposedly split into 2 teams, one group attempting to return to the tent, the other staying behind to construct a snow den. The tent group then attempted to climb 1.5 kilometers uphill through brutal winds and extreme cold, only to die of hypothermia on the slope. Heading toward a tent the government claims was now completely buried under snow, by the way. Meanwhile, the den group dug into the snow to create shelter. The state's version insists that the den collapsed and that the 4 hikers inside fell 6 meters horizontally and about 1 meter downward into the ravine, causing their catastrophic internal injuries. But this is where the logic falls apart completely. The construction of both the cedar fire and the den required knives, yet every finished knife belonging to the group was found back in the tent, still sheathed. The only other knife, Dyatlov's pocket knife, was also in the tent. According to the official story, they managed to climb trees, cut branches, build a den without having any knives at all. So, to accept the official explanation, you'd have to believe that the group saw an avalanche, sliced open their tent, fled in the wrong direction while maintaining perfect formation, built a fire but only had 2 people gather wood, split into 2 rational survival teams, sent one group into impossible conditions uphill, and somehow had the den group die by falling sideways and downward at the same time, all while the only knives required for every part of this sequence were back inside the tent. So, basically, none of this makes sense. The avalanche theory really only accounts for one thing: why they may have had to run from their tent. It doesn't explain why the group split up, why they walked in the wrong direction, or how several of them ended up with injuries that make no sense in an avalanche scenario. Yes, okay, some of the hikers likely died from hypothermia even with additional trauma, but we're still left with severe internal and external anomalies: crushing chest injuries, massive skull fractures, missing soft tissue, and lividity patterns that don't line up with how or where the bodies were found. None of that has ever been convincingly explained by the medical examiners or the Russian government, and that is exactly why this case has spawned dozens upon dozens of theories, because the official explanation leaves far more questions than answers. Okay, so let's walk through the environmental explanations that are often presented as reasonable or natural causes, and why none of them actually hold up once you look at the details. Katabatic winds, for example. A katabatic wind is what happens when dense cold air rushes down a slope at extremely high speed. And I mean extremely high speeds. These winds can reach up to about 80 meters per second, which is about 179 miles per hour. There's even a precedent for how dangerous they can be. In 1978, a group of hikers in Sweden died during a Katabatic wind event moving at only 20 meters per second, far slower than what's possible on Call. So how exactly does this apply to Dyatlov? Well, the idea is that the hikers sensed a powerful descending wind formation. They supposedly weighed down the tent with snow and walked downhill to wait it out. And this theory does account for a few things. It explains why the tent was left mostly intact, and it also explains how the group could get turned around and walk in the wrong direction if visibility suddenly tanked. But here's what it doesn't explain. If this was just dangerous wind, not an avalanche, why did they leave behind almost all of their warm clothing and gear? They still had seconds, maybe even a minute, to grab parkas, boots, gloves. Walking out half-dressed into sub-zero temperatures doesn't match a wind evacuation. It simply doesn't line up with human survival instinct. Another natural cause theory is the infrasound panic theory. Infrasound is low-frequency sound under 20 hertz, too low for humans to hear but capable of causing nausea, panic, anxiety, disorientation, even a sudden sense of dread. It's been referenced historically in psychological warfare, including Taliban operations. The idea here is that an infrasound wave hit the tent, caused sudden panic, and sent the group fleeing into the night. Then, once the effect passed, they tried to return, which is why some footprints turned back toward the tent. On paper, that fits some of the behavior, but here's the problem. The footprints leaving the tent were calm and organized. They walked in a straight, orderly, single-file line. There are no signs of running, scattering, zigzagging, or chaotic flight. If they truly were panicking, the scene around the tent would have looked very different. Another theory argues that the group's portable camping stove ignited inside the tent. That would explain a rapid escape and maybe even some of the burn-related injuries. Except the physical evidence does not support this at all. If the stove had really caught fire inside the tent, we'd see burn marks on the canvas, on the gear, on the surrounding snow, but there were none. The tent is cut, but not burned. And again, this theory doesn't address any of the big questions. Why did they go the wrong way? Why didn't they return once they realized the tent wasn't on fire? How do severe injuries enter the picture? It just doesn't add up. This is where the exhaustion explanation falls apart. The official narrative claims Doroshenko and Krivonashenko were the ones gathering wood and climbing the cedar tree for branches, and that they died first from exhaustion and exposure. But in a true survival situation, everyone would collect wood and contribute. 2 people would never be solely responsible for keeping 9 people alive. And their injuries, especially the ones consistent with falling from the tree, suggest something far more complicated than simply getting tired and collapsing. So when you put all of these natural environment theories together, like Katabatic winds, infrasound, a stove fire, labor exhaustion, they fail to explain the core pieces of this case. The injuries, the decision-making, the missing gear, the split between the 2 groups, and the direction they walked. And when natural explanations fall apart this completely, we're forced to consider theories that involve external pressure, conflict, or trauma. For decades, one of the most persistent explanations has been the idea that the hikers were attacked by the Mansi, the indigenous people native to this region. The theory claims the group wandered into a sacred area or crossed paths with Mansi hunters who were aggressive or intoxicated, and that a confrontation spiraled into violence. It's a story that gained traction mostly because the Dyatlov team traveled through Mansi territory on their way toward Mount Otorten. But when you look at what the hikers actually documented, that theory starts falling apart immediately. Across all the group's diaries, the word Mansi appears about 20 times. The first mentions come on January 27th when Slobodin and Dubinina write that workers at District 41 taught them a few Mansi words. 2 days later, Zena's diary and the group diary both talk about passing Mansi symbols and following a Mansi trail. They even photographed a Mansi labaz, an elevated storage structure used to keep supplies safe from animals. On January 30th, multiple journals mention seeing more Mansi markers, passing a Mansi shed, and talking about Mansi culture. One entry even describes the group as a northern people of around 8,000 individuals with unique symbols that looked obscure and mysterious. An unsigned entry from that day jokes that the trip's slogan should be "In the land of mysterious signs." But here's what's missing. They never saw a village, never stopped in a yurt, never wrote about a visit, a conflict, or even a strange interaction. The closest they ever got was noticing markings on trees and spotting a Mansi hunter with the deer on the Mansi Trail on January 31st. When the hikers were first declared missing, Mansi hunters were among the first people to join the search effort. Investigators interviewed them extensively. Then there's the so-called confession story from 2019. A man named Anatoly Stepkin told a Russian newspaper that back in 1981, he met a Mansi man who supposedly confessed after a lot of vodka that the hikers had looted a sacred site, that shamans cut the tent, that hunters smoked them out, and that the group was then killed when they ran. He even said they recovered gold, furs, and platinum from the bodies. None of that aligns with Mansi culture. The Mansi don't store valuables at sacred sites. Their sacred mountain is about 40 kilometers south of Dyatlov Pass, and Stepkin only told this story after police questioned him about a shotgun possibly used in a crime. His claims don't match the diaries, the photographs, or the group's actual route. Searchers did find Mansi tracks about 10 kilometers from the group, along with a newly built Mansi chum about a kilometer beyond that, but that's normal. The Mansi live, hunt, and travel all across that region. Experienced hunters told investigators that in all their years traveling through the Mansi region, they were always kind and willing to help outsiders. Mansi hunter Grigory Krikov confirmed there were no sacred sites anywhere near where the hikers died, no reason the Mansi would attack travelers, and absolutely no indication of violence. And multiple witnesses agreed. The sacred mountain is far south, not near Dyatlov Pass, and the Mansi would never join a search team if they knew one of their own was responsible. In the end, there's simply nothing to support this theory. No confrontation, no hostility, no evidence in the journals, no motive, no geography that aligns. The Mansi helped search for these hikers, which alone makes them some of the least likely people to have harmed them. Even if rumors or legends floated around years later, nothing in the actual record supports a Mansi attack. The Dyatlov Pass mystery has always carried an eerie, unsettling quality. Scattered bodies, partial undress, catastrophic injuries, and naturally, that opened the door for some of the most sensationalized theories imaginable. One of the loudest, that the group was attacked by a Yeti. This idea didn't originate from evidence or witness accounts, but from pop culture, imagination, and televised networks looking for ratings. Shows leaned into the idea that if the hikers were running from someone or something, then a creature must have been involved. Discovery's Russian Yeti, The Killer Lives, pushed this the hardest. The special followed the same patterns as their previous hoax documentaries: dramatic narration, speculative claims presented as fact, and zero credible experts. It took a real tragedy and repackaged it as entertainment. The show exaggerated or fabricated details like claiming a missing tongue proved an avalanche didn't happen or that something ripped it out, even though the soft tissue loss is fully explainable by decomposition and animal activity and running water. It referenced classified Soviet Yeti files without providing any proof they exist, and framed interviews to fit its predetermined conclusions. The documentary also relied heavily on an infamous black and white photo of a dark figure among trees, presenting it as a mysterious creature captured by the Dyatlov group. In reality, it's almost certainly just one of the hikers bundled in winter clothing. They photographed each other constantly. The proportions match a person, not a creature, and skeptics have even questioned the authenticity of the photo given Discovery's history of staged footage. The only other tie to the Yeti theory goes back to the satirical publication the group created during their last night, mentioning a snowman in the Urals. Remember though, this publication was never authenticated by experts. Importantly, nothing in the physical evidence supports an animal or creature attack. There were no animal tracks, no bite or claw marks, no drag signs, and no defensive wounds typical of wildlife encounters. Injuries often cited in Yeti theories like missing eyes or missing tongue are explained by natural post-mortem processes: water flow, decomposition, snow movement, and scavenging. So why exactly does this theory persist? Well, because monster stories make for compelling television, especially when the real answers are far more complicated, messy, or still incomplete. Dyatlov Pass is already a strange case, and when documentaries combine dramatic editing with selective facts, audiences can be easily led toward the most sensational explanation. Experts and researchers have criticized the documentary for distorting facts, ignoring science, and using questionable on-air experts. Even cryptozoologist Igor Burtsev said the production repeatedly pressured him to say the hikers were killed by a Yeti, something he refused to do. Bottom line, the Dyatlov incident has no credible connection to Yetis, creatures, or cryptids of any kind. Every element used to support that idea has a grounded, evidence-based explanation, none of which involve a monster stalking the hikers in the snow. Now, there's another theory that's followed this case for decades, the idea that something in the sky drove the hikers out of their tent. And a lot of that stems from one photograph, often labeled Frame 33, depending on how you categorize certain damaged frames from Zolotariov's role. Some conspiracy theorists insist the photo shows a glowing object in the sky and that whatever it was might have terrified the group as they settled in for the night. Around that same time frame, the Soviet military launched several rockets from the Baikonur Cosmodrome. Officially, those rockets landed in the northern Urals, but multiple geologists working roughly 70 kilometers from the mountains reported seeing glowing, pulsating orbs in the direction of Kolotsykal on the evening of February 1st, the very same night everything unfolded. Those sightings were some of the earliest sparks for the UFO angle. The idea gained more traction years later when Lev Ivanov, the lead investigator in 1959, began speaking more openly. In interviews, he claimed that he and E.P. Maslenikov saw something unusual near the forest edge, pine trees with burned tops. The burn patterns had no circular shape, no blast radiation, and no clear source. Ivanov also claimed that high-ranking Soviet officials, specifically A.P. Kirilenko of the Soviet Congress and his advisor, pressured him to remove anything in the reports that referenced glowing spheres, strange lights, Mansi drawings of airborne objects, or testimony describing phenomena in the sky. Now, skeptics point out that Ivanov shared these details decades later, at a time when paranormal interest in Russia was booming. But the part about Kirilenko is documented and genuinely strange. Kirilenko developed a deep fascination with UFOs in the early 1960s, long before it was trendy. He repeatedly filed requests to access KGB UFO archives, something the Soviet government actively discouraged, especially among high-ranking officials. His obsession has always stood out. Then, in 1990, Ivanov published an article called The Enigma of the Fireballs. In it, he claimed that he had withheld certain materials back in 1959 because of pressure from Kirilenko and others. According to him, these materials hinted at the involvement of, quote, fireballs, phenomena he believed were connected to whatever happened that night. He described scorched pine treetops with no blast pattern and suggested that the burns were caused by focused, directed energy, something unknown to Soviet investigators at the time. He believed that whatever caused the burns might have selectively acted on the hikers. Supporters of this theory believe the group may have seen those glowing orbs in the sky, they may have assumed the lights were part of the military test or something entirely different. Their rapid exit from the tent might have been fear, disorientation from bright aerial activity, or the belief that something was about to explode above them. And this theory hasn't gone away, partly because of the lights seen by the geologists, the burned treetops, Zolotariov's mysterious camera frame, Ivanov's later admission that he removed UFO references, and Kirilenko's documented involvement in UFO investigations. Of course, none of this proves anything extraterrestrial, but it does show that there were unexplained aerial events over the Urals during that period and possibly political pressure to bury those details. So, knowing what we know about the diary entries and photos, we have to reopen the question that's been hanging over this entire case. Why was Semyon Zolotariov even there, and more specifically, why was he wearing his camera when the group fled the tent? Everyone else grabbed whatever clothing they could in a panic. Socks, sweaters, a blanket, pieces of each other's clothing. But Zolotariov either took the time to put on a camera before stepping out into the blizzard, or he was already wearing it, late at night before anything had even gone wrong. Either scenario leaves us with the same unsettling question. Why? And that question only deepens when you remember this. He was never supposed to be part of the Dyatlov group at all. His spot was handed to him at the last minute, and it didn't come from Dyatlov or any of the other hikers. The 10th spot originally belonged to Vladislav Bianco, Dyatlov's close friend and classmate. Just days before the departure, Bianco was suddenly summoned by the Komsomol Committee, the Soviet youth political arm, essentially the USSR's answer to the Hitler Youth. They told him he wouldn't be able to go because he spent his winter break training on hikes instead of doing his mandatory community labor. He was reassigned to a lumber camp instead. Then they ordered him to hand over all of his gear, his boots, his clothing, his supplies, directly to Zolotariov, who would take his place. And that decision has never made sense. This wasn't a simple student swap. They replaced a 20-year-old engineering student with a 38-year-old World War II veteran they'd never met. Bianco would later describe Zolotariov as cheerful, charming, and quick to blend in with the group, but even with that, it doesn't explain why the party forced the exchange. Zolotariov's background adds another layer to this mystery. He was born on February 22, 1921, fought through the entire Second World War, and then an additional year after that. Only 3% of the men drafted with him survived. After the war, he worked in roles where proving loyalty mattered. Eventually, he resurfaced as a sports instructor. But his military past, his experience, and whatever he carried with him for those years never left his records or his reputation. So, the question becomes, why would the party want him on this trip? Some believe Bianco wasn't removed because of misconduct. He was removed because someone wanted Zolotariov inserted. Maybe the group wasn't the reason he was sent. Maybe the location was, or maybe the timing, or maybe the presence of another hiker. If the party needed someone on that mountain, it wasn't one of the students, it was him. And that brings us back to the camera, the single most suspicious detail. He was fully dressed when the group fled, which makes sense if he was on night watch, but the camera around his neck does not. He took very few photos during the expedition. The only images recovered from his personal camera were the partially damaged frames found on his body. It was pitch black outside, far too dark to photograph anything. So either he intentionally grabbed it as they ran, or he was already wearing it when disaster began. Both scenarios point to the same thing. He expected to use that camera. He was ready to document something. Historians and investigators have asked the same question ever since. Was he instructed to photograph a person, a test, a military event, a phenomenon in the sky? Was he given his own instructions separate from the rest of the group? There's also the possibility, raised by several researchers, that Zolotariov wasn't monitoring an event, but a person. One of the hikers, Katabatic, had ties to a top-secret atomic institute. It's possible Zolotariov's job was to keep an eye on him, or maybe he was there to record a planned military test. Or maybe he was simply acting as an observer on behalf of the party. No one actually knows, and importantly, none of that means he was even involved in the group's deaths. There's zero indication that he harmed anyone, and politically, it makes no sense for the USSR to sacrifice 8 loyal students just to eliminate one older veteran. If anything, his presence raises questions about what he knew, what he was supposed to witness, and what he was meant to document. And basically, this is what we're left with. We still don't know why he grabbed the camera. We still don't know why he was chosen for the trip. We still don't know what he was sent to observe or who. But his presence, and especially his actions, matter because they shape the theories that come next. Now, while Zolotariov's reason for having that camera around his neck is still a mystery, we can follow the next logical thread: the strange lights reported that night and the possibility of aerial involvement. The strange lights reported on February 1st didn't just spark UFO speculation. They also steered investigators toward something far more grounded: the possibility that the hikers walked into the path of Soviet military activity. Early in the investigation, many believed the group may have been caught in the aftermath of a secret launch, a classified test, or an accidental exposure to something they were never meant to see. Inside the Dyatlov case files, there's a radiogram that still stands out. It reports that a meteorological rocket was observed over Ivdel on February 1st, the exact night the hikers abandoned their tent. Caroline's search team reported seeing the same thing. The tone of the message is clear. Investigators themselves believed a man-made aerial event could have triggered the group's sudden escape. Journalist Vladimir Korotayev said that scientists close to Korolyov, the legendary chief designer of Soviet rocketry, quietly hinted that tests were being conducted in that region. Official launch logs insist that no rockets were launched on February 1st or 2nd, but the absence of records only makes the rumor more suspicious. Meanwhile, locals passed down stories for decades: hidden military training zones deep in the forest, sealed tunnels, and low mechanical rumbling like a train running underground. All of this created a climate of uneasy possibility. Yekaterinburg journalist Kizilov became the strongest public advocate for the idea that the hikers witnessed something classified, and that they were killed to protect the secrecy around it. He believes the scene rescuers found was staged. According to him, the hikers died elsewhere. Their bodies were moved, the diaries were edited, and the tent was pitched on an exposed slope where experienced hikers would never choose to camp. He claims military or KGB personnel arrived before the official search and set up the false scene. In 2008, a joint conference between Ural State Technical University and the Dyatlov Group Memorial Foundation concluded that military testing was the most plausible explanation. Not an avalanche, not a Mansi attack. The Federal Security Service responded by saying all involved officials were long deceased and gave no further comment. Former KGB officer and medical expert Vladimir Negaev pushed an even more technical theory. The hikers weren't just trekking, they were assisting with a scientific experiment. He argued that the group launched radiosones containing short-lived radioactive isotopes inside chloroprene balloons. According to him, a meteorological rocket collided with one or more of these probes, releasing a toxic gas cloud over the group. Negaev claimed the absence of detectable toxins doesn't disprove this. Some sulfur-based gases break down too fast to appear in tests, but their effects linger in the body through pulmonary edema, dark fluid blood, organ congestion, and enlargement of the right side of the heart. All features documented in the autopsies. He also pointed to the month-long delay before the bodies were found, noting that 2 half-lives of phosphorus-32 would have passed, reducing radioactive traces. Witness descriptions of darkened skin further supported his theory and his view. A more dramatic Cold War angle emerged from author Alexei Rakitin, who argued that Zolotariov, Kolevatov, and Krivonashenko were KGB operatives on a mission to deliver radioactive samples to CIA agents disguised as hikers. He cited Zolotaryov's NKVD background and mysterious tattoo, Kolevatov's work at a secret atomic lab, and Krivonashenko's job at the Mayak facility. According to Rakitin, the operation turned violent and ended in torture and death. Friends and surviving acquaintances of the group dismissed this outright. Another theory suggests the hikers wandered into a protected military test zone and were confronted by soldiers. In this version, the group was forced out of their tent, possibly injured during non-lethal takedown techniques, and left exposed in sub-zero temperatures. Researcher Alexander Gulikov proposed an even more intricate scenario involving unauthorized helicopter use by high-ranking officers during a Communist Party Congress. He claimed Zolotaryov photographed one of these helicopters, prompting the group to move camp. A military team then located the tent on February 1st, searching for a hidden camera wrapped in radioactive clothing. A confrontation escalated into violence, resulting in internal injuries resembling martial arts-style impacts, powerful but without significant external trauma. Some hikers died immediately, others succumbed while trying to escape down the slope. The theory concludes that military personnel staged the scene afterward, scattering bodies, brushing away tracks, and sanitizing the area. Now, if we follow the Soviet confrontation theory step by step, the entire sequence begins with one assumption. Whatever Semyon Zolotaryov saw outside that tent, he thought it was important enough to photograph. And in this version of events, that single choice is what triggers everything that comes next. The theory suggests that someone saw him or saw whatever he captured and intervened. Not slowly, not bureaucratically, immediately. In 1959, a 38-year-old veteran with a complicated service record added to a student expedition at the last minute, carrying 2 cameras, would have stood out. especially in a region where the military was conducting activity the public wasn't supposed to know about. In this reconstruction, a helicopter is the first point of contact. It aligns with the strange lights, eyewitness accounts of aerial presence, and the odd figure captured in that blurry photo. A helicopter approaching the slope at night. Wind roaring, snow blasting across the ridge would have been impossible to ignore. Before the group could even react, soldiers reach the tent. There isn't a warning. There isn't time to negotiate. The hikers cut their way out from the inside, forced to leave immediately. Their footprints, straight, calm, single file, fit a group being marched, not running, in chaos, and their lack of boots, jackets, and basic gear becomes easier to explain under that kind of pressure. They weren't allowed to stop and gather anything. As they moved downhill, tension builds. A few of the men try to resist or break away. In that struggle, the group fractures. At the cedar tree, Doroshenko and Krivonashenko attempt to climb for height or escape, but fall or are overtaken by cold and exhaustion. Their clothing becomes survival material for the rest, one of the few details fully supported by physical evidence. Thibault's head injury, far beyond what a simple fall would cause, fits into the timeline next. In this version of the story, he's caught by soldiers and thrown into the ravine, hitting rock or ice with enough force to fracture his skull. Up the slope, Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin are confronted again during their attempt to return to the tent. Their injuries, bruised knuckles, abrasions, blunt force trauma are interpreted as signs of interrogation or physical confrontation. They collapse in the cold and never make it back. Down in the ravine, the remaining four become the focus. Investigators and pathologists have long pointed to their internal injuries, massive rib fractures, organ trauma, as the most unusual part of the entire case. Supporters of this theory compare those injuries to known Soviet close-quarter techniques, chest compression, controlled strikes, takedowns that leave minimal external markings. Kolevatov's neck trauma, Dubinina's extensive rib fractures, and Zolotariov's broken ribs all become part of that interpretation. Soft tissue loss, Dubinina's tongue and eyes, Zolotariov's missing eyes is officially attributed to water and decomposition. In this theory, however, those injuries are reinterpreted as deliberate or staged to confuse investigators. Thibault is already mortally injured by this point. Kolevatov likely succumbs next. Where the theory sharpens is at the point when the soldiers in this retelling realize that they were in the wrong. Zolotariov wasn't a foreign agent. The hikers weren't spies, and what they witnessed, whatever it was accidental. By the time this becomes clear, all 9 have died from trauma, exposure, or a combination of both. A cover-up becomes the only option. Bodies repositioned to resemble natural deaths, tracks smoothed over, the tent left slashed and exposed, items removed or scattered to muddy the timeline, diaries and testimonies later filtered, Zolotariov's film damaged or destroyed, leaving only fragments behind. This version of events attempts to tie together nearly every anomaly: the orderly footprints, the lack of warm clothing, the massive internal injuries, the divided groups, the missing film, the pressure on investigators, and the inconsistencies in the search. It's one of the most detailed theories because it tries to retrofit all of the evidence into one cohesive explanation. But whether it stands up to scrutiny or collapses under its own weight is exactly what needs to be examined. This entire category of theories remains appealing to some because it neatly accounts for so many unresolved details. The missing camera, radioactive clothing, massive internal injuries with minimal external damage, disappearing knives, the tent's bizarre placement, contradictory witness statements, delays in the search, and the presence of military materials near the ravine. After laying out every major theory, natural, environmental, paranormal, military, and everything in between, we end up circling back to the same place we were left at in part 1. No single explanation fits this case cleanly. Every theory patches one hole while tearing open another, and when you sit with the physical evidence, the contradictions become even harder to ignore. Here's what we know for certain. The tent was sliced open from the inside. The hikers walked away in a calm, orderly line. 2 died at the Cedar, 3 died spaced along the slope, 4 died in the ravine, 3 of them from catastrophic internal trauma. Radioactive particles were found on a few items of clothing. Most of the group had no shoes. They left behind gloves, parkas, and knives, but still managed to build a fire and construct a den. No one fought inside the tent, and there was no avalanche debris consistent with a real slab release on that slope. When you compare these facts to the theories, the gaps become obvious. The Avalanche theory explains why they fled, but not why the tent stayed standing or why the den was built so carefully. Katabatic winds and infrasound explain disorientation, but not crushed ribs or massive head trauma. The Yeti theory explains absolutely nothing except why Discovery Channel got good ratings. The UFO and fireball reports help us understand the lights people saw that night, but don't necessarily explain why only some bodies showed unusual tissue loss. Secret rocket launches fill in pieces of the radiation puzzle, but don't match the force needed for the injuries. The toxic gas theory accounts for certain organ changes, but doesn't align with the high-impact fractures. And the espionage and special forces theories, while compelling in some areas, still rely on assumptions that can't be proven. What truly stands out after all of this is the same set of stubborn details: the massive internal injuries with almost no external trauma, the missing soft tissue found only on the ravine group, the limited radiation on only 2 hikers' clothing, the missing knives despite clear evidence of cutting, the mystery of Zolotariov's extra camera, the calm, almost methodical descent, the intentionally built den, and the fact that 3 ravine victims died from force, not cold. Most researchers end up settling on some type of combination theory, a sudden external threat that forced them from the tent, followed by extreme weather conditions and disorientation, and then a second event that caused the fatal injuries in the ravine. Maybe they fell. Maybe the snow collapsed. Maybe something else happened entirely, but no matter which angle you take, something is always left unexplained. And maybe that's why this story continues to draw people in more than 65 years later, because these were highly trained, capable hikers who found themselves in a situation so extreme that even now, with modern science and decades of reanalysis, we still can't put the pieces together neatly. This isn't a mystery that bends to one clean narrative, and maybe that's exactly why it stays with us long after we close the case file. Thanks so much for joining me for this episode of Darkly Speaking. If you want to keep up with more stories like this, make sure you're following along on socials at Darkly Speaking Podcast. Also, don't forget to send in your stories and case requests to darklyspeakingpodcast@gmail.com, or you can check out our website, darklyspeakingpodcast.com. And with that, I'll see you next time with a brand new episode.